Royal Alcazar, Madrid. November 6, 1661. You hear screams. Not the ceremonial cries of childbirth the court has rehearsed for weeks. These are guttural. Wild. Ripping through the stone like claws. The kind of sound that makes the virgin statues tremble in their alcoves. Torches burn low in the corridor outside the queen's chamber. The walls sweat with heat and incense. Armed guards stand rigid, eyes forward, pretending not to hear. A nun clutches a cloth to her mouth to muffle her sobbing. No one speaks. No one moves. Everyone knows what's behind that door. Inside, the air is thick and wet. Dozens of candles flicker against the cold stone, their flames dancing like nervous hands. The room stinks of iron and linen. A priest mutters Latin under his breath as if words alone can hold back something ancient and terrible. The queen writhes on the blood-darkened bed. Her eyes are wide, rimmed with cracked veins, locked on the vaulted ceiling as if begging the heavens to take her. She screams again. A sound that seems to peel the paint from the ceiling. A midwife, soaked to the elbows in red, braces her weight and pulls. There is a silence. Then a sound. Not a cry. A gasp. A wet, wheezing intake of breath. The thing in her hands is wrapped quickly in linens. No announcement. No cheers from the waiting chamber. No bells tolling in the courtyard. Just the tense shuffle of feet and the low, shaking voice of a servant asking if it's alive. The infant is carried into the candlelight. Faces turn away. Its skin is colorless. The jaw grotesquely juts forward, forcing the mouth open in a slack, unnatural gape. A thick, purplish tongue spills over its lip. One eye drifts. The other stares, wide and glassy, as though already aware of its burden. The priest steps forward. He does not bless it. Instead, he leans in, close enough to smell it, and whispers through clenched teeth, "He must never be seen by the people." Two midwives nod, trembling. They take the child and vanish into a side door, their steps muffled by thick velvet. No one asks where they're going. Outside, the bells do not ring. The cannons do not fire. Spain's future has just arrived, but there is no celebration. The queen lies back in silence. Her eyes roll back. She does not speak again. And in the hushed corridors of the greatest palace in the empire, the birth of a king is treated like a crime. Something has entered this world that should not have. And the silence that follows is not peace, but fear. What secret was so horrifying, that the monarchy spent decades burying it? If this story doesn't deserve to be silenced, why aren't you subscribed? And if it does, then say so. Loud. In the comments. We're listening. Before the blood, before the screams, before her name was bound to tragedy, she was simply Mariana. A daughter of Vienna. The Archduchess of Austria. She was not a fool. Contrary to what the men in her court whispered, Mariana of Austria was not some soft-eyed girl married off without understanding. She had been raised in corridors of whispered prayers and soft-footed servants. She knew how power worked, how it crept behind smiles and knelt at altars. She could read Latin before she could braid her hair. She debated theology with her tutors before her voice had lost its childlike softness. And by the time her marriage was arranged to her uncle, King Philip IV of Spain, she understood exactly what she was being asked to do. She would not just become queen. She would become a vessel. A vessel for continuity. For legacy. For a bloodline that had begun to fold in on itself like a dying star. But in private, her pen betrayed her. In a small, leather-bound journal, hidden behind the false panel of a gilded cabinet, Mariana wrote letters, never meant for eyes beyond her confessors. They were never signed. But the ink was hers. And the handwriting unmistakable. She wrote of dreams. Of malformed infants in cradles of bone. Of fires that would not warm, and of mouths filled with teeth but unable to speak. She wrote of her own blood feeling wrong inside her, heavy, cursed. She spoke of the eyes of her relatives, those two close cousins, those uncles who became husbands, and how their faces blurred in her mind until she could no longer tell one from the other. She prayed. She prayed obsessively, violently, like a woman bargaining with God himself. Let the child be whole. Let the child be sound. Let the child be not like the others. And still, the court smiled. Still, the wedding proceeded. She arrived in Spain beneath archways of roses, met with applause, bells, and the blind optimism of a court too terrified to look behind its own curtains. They celebrated her beauty, her virtue, her Habsburg pedigree. But behind closed doors, Mariana knew what was expected. Not happiness. Not love. An heir. A son. And she feared, more than death itself, that she would succeed. She wrote once, in a letter never sent, I fear what grows inside me. I fear that I am not carrying a child, but a consequence. History would prove her right. If these words feel heavy, it's because they are. This wasn't fiction. These were the thoughts of a woman who had everything, except escape. And if her story is worth hearing, then it's worth remembering. If you haven't subscribed yet, ask yourself why. And if you still won't, tell us in the comments why silence should win. The child born that night, Charles, was not a fluke. He was an outcome. And to understand why, you must look not at him, but at those who came before. You must read the Habsburg family tree not as a lineage, but as a warning. Start with Charles's parents. Philip IV of Spain and Mariana of Austria were uncle and niece. This was not unusual in the Habsburg line. It was standard practice. Strategic, calculated, cloaked in the language of divine right and dynastic purity. Philip's parents were first cousins. His grandparents? Also first cousins. His great-grandparents? Siblings by blood, and by law. Generation after generation, the tree narrowed. Branches doubled back on themselves. Entire lines merged again and again until the Habsburg tree no longer resembled a tree at all, but a noose. Modern geneticists have a name for this. The coefficient of inbreeding. It measures the probability that two alleles in an individual are identical by descent. In normal populations, the number is low, negligible. In Charles II, it was 0.254. To put that into context, higher than the offspring of brother and sister. Higher than anything nature would ever permit outside the walls of a palace. Charles was the end result of 2 centuries of recursive union. A biological experiment cloaked in gold and scripture. His very existence was a testament to how far a family would go to preserve power, and how blind it had become to the cost. Earlier children bore warning signs. Records buried in monastic libraries describe royal infants born without eyelids. Others with hydrocephalus, heads swollen with fluid, unable to breathe without constant supervision. There were whispers of a prince who lived only 7 hours, born with 2 hearts and no tongue. Another, never formally recorded, was said to have been put back into the ground without a name. And yet, the marriages continued. Austrian cousins wedded Spanish ones. Nieces were matched to uncles. Generations collapsed inward like a house with too many mirrors and no light. Doctors observed. Priests blessed. And anyone who dared to question the practice risked being branded a heretic. Because in Spain, the bloodline was not just sacred. It was the kingdom itself. Even today, the official portraits lie. They show noble men with proud jaws and regal foreheads. They show queens in silks and pearls. But what they do not show, are the shaking hands. The limps. The hollowed eyes. The locked doors. The stillbirths. Charles II was born with the weight of this silence on his shoulders. But he was not the beginning. He was the last. If you're still here, you already know this story matters. And if you believe others need to hear it, subscribe. But if you don't, if you still choose silence over truth, the comments section is open. Tell the world why this story should remain buried. The child was not supposed to survive the night. And yet, against every whispered prayer, every grim diagnosis, every silent plea that he slipped back into whatever place he came from, he lived. The records we have were never meant to be seen. They survived not in royal archives, but in hidden corners of monasteries, in the journals of terrified midwives, and in the confessions of old priests who could no longer keep silent. One midwife, many years later, long after she had taken vows and entered a convent, wrote in a coded script that the infant did not cry like other newborns. He gasped, wheezed, as if struggling against the very air. His eyes did not blink. His hands did not close. She would never speak publicly again. Another, younger, wrote only a single line in the margin of a prayer book: "He was not like us." The priest who performed the emergency baptism offered a different version. In one account, he described the child as weak, but normal. In another, written just before his death, he admitted the truth: the boy's tongue filled his mouth. He drooled as if he had no control of it. His limbs were soft, like overripe fruit, and his skull, it pulsed. It seemed not finished. Later, buried beneath layers of ceremonial reports, a medical note surfaced. It described the newborn's jaw as protruding unnaturally, with structural immobility that rendered suckling impossible. His palate was said to be underformed, his eyes, not symmetrical, and his breathing, labored, inconsistent, suggestive of internal obstruction or cranial pressure. Attempts were made, desperate, frantic, to feed him. The queen herself tried to nurse him, but the child could not latch. His jaw would not close. Milk spilled down his chin, soaking his swaddling, mixing with saliva and blood. A goldsmith was summoned to fashion a feeding tube. Then another. Then a third. None worked. Eventually, a team of physicians designed a crude press, meant to mold the infant's jaw into place. It was bound in leather and bone, fastened across his tiny face like a torture device. The baby screamed. Then he stopped screaming. They took this as success. He didn't cry again for 3 weeks. All the while, Queen Mariana remained bedridden. No visitors. No servants. Only her confessor and the ghostly presence of a cradle that sat in silence beside her. She did not speak. Not when the bells rang falsely to announce a healthy heir. Not when foreign diplomats arrived to celebrate, with rehearsed applause and falsified reports. Not even when her husband came to see her, once, and then never again. But then, one morning, she emerged. Painted. Poised. Eyes glassy, lips curled into the perfect royal smile. She descended the marble staircase of the Alcazar as if nothing had happened. As if she had not given birth to a secret. As if her body had not been broken open to deliver Spain a future it could not survive. No one spoke of her weeks of absence. No one mentioned the bruises on her arms, or the tremor in her left hand. The queen had returned. And with her, the lie. If you're still watching, it means you're drawn into the truth they wanted buried. Honor Mariana's silence, subscribe. And if not, confess why in the comments. We'll be waiting. There was never a question of what had to happen next. The truth could not exist. Not in Spain. Not in the court of God's anointed king. Not when the child in question bore the name Charles, the same as emperors who had ruled from the Alps to the Andes. So the machine began to turn. A nursery was built. Not near the queen's chambers, but in a fortified wing of the palace, far from prying eyes. Guards were stationed outside the door. No one entered without written permission sealed by the royal confessor. Even high nobles were denied. Inside, the work of deception began. When the boy was 6 months old and still could not hold his head upright, an artist was commissioned to paint him sitting tall, eyes bright, a hand raised in gesture. When he was a year old and had not yet stood, a tutor was hired to write glowing reports of his development, his cleverness, his interest in books, his curiosity about maps. When he was 2 and still silent, actors were brought in to pose as visitors who had heard him say his first words in Latin. The portraits multiplied. Each one carefully posed, with shadows cast to obscure the swollen cheeks, the bulging jaw, the lolling tongue. His hands were painted resting gently on silk, though in life they trembled constantly. His eyes were often shown turned upward, in serene thought, when in truth, he rarely seemed aware of his surroundings at all. The artists were briefed before each sitting. A painter who refused to lie was dismissed. Another, who painted too faithfully, disappeared on his journey home. The court clapped. The ambassadors wrote their reports. And Spain carried on. But beneath the surface, the Inquisition had been stirred. The whispers had begun. Why was the prince never seen in motion? Why were his nurses replaced so frequently? Why were the bells rung for his first words 3 different times? Priests investigated. Quietly. Not to expose, but to contain. One inquisitor wrote, "It is not our place to doubt the child. It is our place to preserve the will of God through the sanctity of blood." But others were less convinced. A scholar from Toledo, who had once tutored royal cousins, questioned the official records. He published a treatise suggesting that inbreeding might be a sin of unnatural preservation. The Inquisition arrested him 2 weeks later. His book was burned. He was never seen again. In the years that followed, any mention of the prince's condition, no matter how carefully phrased, was met with silence, dismissal, or disappearance. Spain had created a new religion. The cult of the healthy prince. And no heresy was more dangerous than the truth. Even now, centuries later, the residue of that silence remains. The portraits still hang in museums. The falsified letters still sit in archives. The lie still breathes. And if you've heard it your whole life, that Charles II was merely sickly, then ask yourself, who told you that? And why? If you believe stories like this should be told in full, then now is the time to subscribe. But if you still choose silence, if you still think these secrets belong in shadows, say so in the comments. We're not just listening. We're remembering. No laughter echoed from the royal nursery. No clattering toys on marble floors. No nursery rhymes sung by soft-voiced maids. Only silence, pierced now and then by muffled groans, wet coughing, or the quiet sobbing of exhausted women who had been sworn into a secret they could never escape. The attendants of Charles II were not nannies. They were guardians of a state secret. Every woman, every servant, every physician who entered the child's chamber was bound by oath, some under pain of death, others under the weight of their own conscience. Most were forbidden to speak even to each other. Their purpose was not to raise the child. It was to contain him. By the age of 3, Charles could not walk. He could not speak. He could not chew solid food, or sit upright without support. His limbs bent unnaturally. His eyes wandered. His tongue lolled from his mouth, too large to be held in place. When he slept, it was fitful. When he woke, it was to confusion, distress, or silence. And yet the court demanded progress. Physicians were brought in from across Europe. They examined the boy by candlelight, muttering diagnoses none dared write down. Some blamed the mother. Others whispered of possession. When the herbs failed, when the poultices soured, the court turned to ritual. An exorcist was summoned. A Dominican friar, gaunt and hollow-eyed, entered the nursery with relics and holy water. The child was strapped to a table. Psalms were shouted. Salt was pressed against his lips. At one point, a silver crucifix was forced into his hands until blood appeared in his palm. There was no improvement. Another was brought. This one quieter. He lit no candles. He merely whispered into the prince's ear for hours. No one knows what was said. That friar died of fever within the month. Behind these events, a paper trail was forming. Secret diaries, kept by the prince's tutors, men trained not to teach but to observe. Their entries are brittle, stained with wax and age, but their words remain sharp. The child's mind is closed. He does not respond to color, sound, nor gesture. He has no language. He knows not mother, nor nurse, nor prayer. Another wrote, "Today he bit his own tongue and bled for an hour. He made no sound." These men were not permitted to leave the court. Some died there. Others went mad. A few disappeared. And through it all, the rumors swirled like ash in a sealed room. That this child, this pale, drooling, twitching prince, was not the real Charles. That the true heir had been born healthy, strong, but had died during labor or shortly after. That another child, the son of a palace servant, horribly deformed and near death, was swapped in desperation. Some said Mariana made the decision herself, to avoid the wrath of her husband. Others claimed the swap was arranged by the Inquisition to punish the crown for its sins. There was never proof. Only whispers. And the silence of a nursery that should have been filled with joy, but instead became a tomb for truth. They buried this story for 400 years, and were unearthing it together. If you won't subscribe now, tell us in the comments why history doesn't deserve your attention. While Spain cloaked its future in silence and shadows, the rest of Europe began to listen more carefully, to what was not being said. In the courts of Paris, Vienna, and London, ambassadors traded rumors like currency. Messages arrived from Madrid, censored, polished, carefully worded, and yet something in their precision betrayed the panic beneath. Why had no one seen the prince? Why were no celebrations public? Why were paintings delayed, and when they arrived, why did they all look the same? The French ambassador to Spain, a calculating man known for his discretion, wrote in a private dispatch, "The child is pale, silent, and does not seem to know he is being watched. He is less like a boy than a ghost made flesh." He was not the only one disturbed. England's envoy, skeptical by nature, attempted to bribe a low-ranking physician. The bribe was refused. The physician was arrested the next day. The ambassador was recalled 2 weeks later. Austria's spies were more successful. They infiltrated the nursery staff, smuggling out handwritten notes, sketches, and whispered confessions. One nurse described the child's breath as labored and foul, as if something inside was rotting. Another claimed his eyes would move in opposite directions, never focusing, even when held still. The most damning item was a crude sketch, smeared in haste, of Charles at 4 years old. The figure was hunched, head enlarged, mouth gaping, one leg bent backward at an unnatural angle. The image was smuggled in the false bottom of a jewelry box and sent directly to the imperial court in Vienna. There, the plans began. France and Austria both knew what Spain would not admit: the boy would not live long, and even if he did, he would never rule. He was incapable. A puppet at best. An open wound at worst. So they began positioning themselves, not for war, not yet, but for inheritance. Diplomats were sent to Rome, to press the Pope for early endorsements of potential successors. Royal marriages were proposed and rejected. Old treaties were re-examined. And all the while, Madrid remained silent. At least publicly. Privately, there were factions. The Queen's inner circle, desperate to preserve the illusion. The nobles, fractured and paranoid. And the Church, watching everything, deciding when and if to intervene. But beyond Spain's borders, the truth was already spreading. In Paris, they laughed. In Vienna, they prepared. In London, they waited. Because while Spain still dressed its tragedy in gold and incense, the rest of Europe saw what was coming, a kingdom built on a crumbling spine. A prince who could not stand. An empire ready to fall. And they would be ready when it did. If you're hearing this now, you're already deeper into this forgotten war than most will ever go. If you think stories like this shouldn't be lost to dust and silence, subscribe. But if you'd rather look away, then tell us why. Because some truths don't disappear. They wait. It should have been a moment of triumph. The culmination of centuries of Habsburg rule. The coronation of a king. Instead, it became a carefully orchestrated illusion. A state-sanctioned hallucination, choreographed with military precision and drenched in denial. Charles was 4 years old. He could not walk unaided. He could not speak. His head, grotesquely enlarged and misshapen, could not support a crown without modification. So they remade it. The golden crown of Castile was melted down and refashioned into a lighter frame, one that wouldn't crush the malformed bone beneath. On the morning of the ceremony, the boy was dressed in embroidered white silk, stiff with gold thread. His attendants tightened cords beneath his shoulders to hold him upright. From a distance, he appeared regal. Up close, the illusion dissolved. He drooled. His eyes wandered. He swayed where he stood, lips slack, while 2 nurses just out of view held his elbows to keep him from collapsing. The cathedral was full. Nobles lined the aisles. Cardinals stood in solemn rows. Outside, the public cheered, not because they believed, but because they had been told to. When the time came for the oath of kingship, a bishop stepped forward and held a scroll before the boy. The child stared at it blankly, then blinked slowly as saliva bubbled at the corner of his mouth. A priest, already prepared, recited the oath in his place. The child's hand was guided to the scroll. He made no mark. So the priest took his hand again, dipped it in ink, and pressed it against the page. A stain. Not a signature. Not a vow. Just a stain. It was enough. The bells rang. The nobles cheered. The Inquisition declared it a moment of divine grace. But behind closed doors, Queen Mariana issued orders as regent, with no plan to relinquish control. Charles was now, in name only, the most powerful monarch in Europe. But power had slipped elsewhere, quietly, greedily. France annexed disputed territories on the border. Austria positioned troops in strategic areas under the guise of protection. English merchants seized shipping lanes once considered untouchable. No war was declared. No battle lines drawn. Why would they be? Spain had crowned a shadow. And shadows cast no resistance. The crown sat crooked on a head too soft to bear its weight. And the empire that once ruled oceans stood still, pretending not to drown. Time did not heal. It devoured. As Charles grew older, the hope that he might develop later became a private joke, whispered behind silk fans and velvet curtains. What remained of optimism began to rot into desperation. His body weakened. His limbs never gained strength. His teeth, those that came at all, grew twisted, overlapping in a mouth too small to contain them. He could not chew. He could not speak. His tongue remained oversized and sluggish. He could not write. He could not read. At 12, he was still being spoon-fed porridge, still soiling his bedding at night. Physicians argued bitterly. One prescribed boiled herbs from the mountains of Leon. Another recommended bloodletting twice a week. A third insisted on holy relics placed beneath the boy's pillow. None of them agreed, and none of them succeeded. One doctor administered mercury. Another resorted to fire cupping. A visiting Italian monk declared Charles possessed, and attempted a full exorcism by candlelight. It ended in violent seizures that lasted for hours. Charles screamed through clenched teeth and foamed at the mouth while priests shouted psalms over his writhing body. The boy was broken. But the court demanded he marry. So proposals were drawn up. Foreign princesses were offered titles, jewels, dowries. Most refused. Some did not believe the rumors. They should have. One ambassador described seeing Charles from behind a tapestry, his spine bent, his mouth slack, his chin dripping with spittle. The ambassador left the next day and never returned. Still, the marriage plans continued. They needed an heir. A miracle. A deception. Court staff wrote false reports of his progress. Tutors were paid to draft essays, by his hand. But some refused to participate in the charade. Their testimonies were never meant to survive, but they did. One wrote, "The boy is vacant. When spoken to, he stares. When fed, he forgets he has eaten. He does not laugh. He does not cry. There is nothing behind his eyes." Another wrote simply, "He is not there." Some whispered that Mariana had long since given up hope, that she no longer visited her son's chambers, choosing instead to rule alone from a room of silence and candle smoke. Others claimed she still sat beside him each night, reading prayers to a boy who no longer knew her name. Behind the gilded walls, there were no courtiers. Only actors. No scholars. Only scribes writing fiction. No king. Only a vessel. And still, Spain endured. Or pretended to. If you believe this boy deserved more than silence and shame, don't scroll past, subscribe. If you're unmoved, tell us in the comments why this history should stay buried. Because this was not just one boy's tragedy. It was a nation's. And it was only beginning. The first bride arrived in a white carriage trimmed with gold. Marie-Louise of Orleans. French blood, Bourbon grace, 17 years old. She crossed the border into Spain under arches of flowers and deafening cheers. Her wedding gown shimmered with pearls. Her veil was stitched by cloistered nuns. Her smile, taut, rehearsed, hid the fear only she seemed to feel. The reports she'd been given were generous. A prince, sickly perhaps, but brilliant in spirit. Reserved. Devout. Quiet, yes, but deeply pious. The French court had downplayed the rumors. Spain's wealth would more than make up for its heir's condition. That was the promise. That was the lie. On the day of the wedding, Marie-Louise stood in a cathedral gilded with firelight, watching her future husband struggle to reach her. Charles could not walk the length of the aisle. He was wheeled in behind a curtain. His robes were stiff and shimmering, but beneath them his body trembled. The crown atop his skull was padded with linen to prevent injury. When it came time to speak his vows, he could not. A court official whispered them for him, then took his hand and guided it toward hers. That night, the doors to the bedchamber closed with ceremonial flare. Candles flickered. Servants withdrew. And inside, silence. Her letters, written weeks later to a cousin in France, are brittle with grief. He is not what I was told. He is not what he is painted to be. His mouth does not close. He cannot form words. He watches me with eyes that do not see. I am afraid to touch him. I am afraid not to. She tried. For years, she tried. Rituals were performed to encourage conception. Relics placed beneath the bed. Special diets imposed. Fertility prayers spoken over her before dawn. Physicians instructed her in mechanical methods of encouragement. Nothing changed. Charles, it was said, attempted to lie beside her. But he was incapable. His body would not respond. His mind wandered. He was a husband in name only. A symbol. A scarecrow wrapped in velvet. Marie-Louise's health deteriorated rapidly. She lost weight. Her hair began to fall out. She cried often, sometimes in front of courtiers who were instructed to ignore her distress. The queen had become an ornament in her own prison. She died at age 26. The official cause, stomach cancer. The unofficial rumor, she stopped eating. Or she was poisoned. No one knows. But she died without children, without peace, and without ever writing the word husband again. Then came the second wife. Mariana of Neuburg. A woman hardened by politics, steeled by years at the court of the Holy Roman Empire. She came with no illusions. She had read the warnings. She had seen the failed portraits. She knew what was expected of her. She did it anyway. At the wedding, she did not flinch. When Charles was presented, swaying and expressionless, she kept her composure. When his hand trembled in hers, she guided it herself. When he drooled during the mass, she wiped his chin with a silk cloth and smiled. But in private, she began keeping her own letters. Coded. Hidden in the bindings of religious books. Passed through trusted intermediaries. He stares at walls for hours. He cannot dress himself. He does not remember our names. Sometimes he shrieks, but cannot explain why. She endured the same humiliations. More fertility rituals. More court pressure. More fabricated announcements of encouraging signs. Her body became a stage, her womb a matter of state. And all the while, she knew, there would be no heir. She described the king as a child in a man's costume. In her final letter before Charles's death, she wrote, "I no longer believe he is fully human. His eyes hold nothing. He does not dream." 2 queens. One broken. One hardened. Neither loved. Both lied to. And neither of them ever saw a future in the man they were forced to call husband. He died on a November night. Not with dignity, not with grace, but in a heap of damp sheets and choking breath. He had been king in name for nearly 4 decades. He had ruled nothing. He had fathered no children. He had spoken no truths. He had simply endured. The court prepared the body with reverence. Incense. Oils. Prayers whispered in Latin. But when the royal physicians examined him privately, after the last rites were performed and the candles had burned low, what they found shattered even the illusions they had spent their lives maintaining. His heart was the size of a walnut. His lungs were blackened, riddled with fluid, likely infected for years. His intestines were bloated, partially rotted. The stomach showed evidence of chronic starvation, despite the constant feeding schedules he'd been subjected to. His genitals were underdeveloped. Almost infantile. It confirmed what both queens had implied in silence: reproduction had never been possible. But the most shocking detail came from the skull. They opened it carefully. Inside, they found clear evidence of hydrocephalus. The brain had been compressed for decades by fluid buildup. Pressure that would have caused migraines, seizures, hallucinations. The fact that Charles could remain conscious at all, they said, was a miracle of suffering. His jaw was fused at the hinges. The famous Habsburg trait, pushed beyond its natural limit. His tongue, bloated and discolored, had contributed to decades of speech impairment and choking. His teeth had never fully come in. In the words of one attending physician, later quoted in secret correspondence, he was less a man than a bundle of broken systems forced to remain alive through cruelty and denial. The report was never published. The body was sealed. And the empire moved on. But years later, in a monastery archive, a single physician's notes surfaced, faded, cracked, but legible. A drawing of the skull. A diagram of the spine. A simple caption beneath the figure of the king: "This is what remains when men defy nature for power." If you've listened this far, you already know this was no mere tragedy, it was a lesson ignored for generations. If you believe it deserves to be remembered, subscribe. And if you still choose silence, then say why in the comments. But know this, silence is what created him. Silence is what killed him. And silence is how history repeats. The king was dying. Not swiftly. Not peacefully. But in the long, twitching, fetid decline of a body held together by ceremony and superstition. Each morning, he was awakened like a relic, washed, dressed, presented. Each night, he returned to his bed like a relic returned to its altar. And Mariana of Neuburg, his second queen, his widow-in-waiting, began writing letters. Not for the court. Not for the church. Not for diplomacy. For herself. They were hidden in prayer books, slipped into candle drawers, sealed inside the hems of her nightclothes. She no longer trusted her confessor. She no longer trusted her ladies. Every word she put to paper was a scream locked in silence. I sit beside him and I do not know if he dreams. He stares into the dark and his mouth moves, but no voice comes. The priest says he prays. I think he is trying to remember what he is. By then, the court was no longer a palace. It was a battlefield without weapons. Factions had splintered into desperate alliances. Nobles forged documents in candlelit chambers. Competing drafts of the king's will passed through secret hands. Some named a French heir. Others favored the Austrian claim. A few even whispered of a Spanish nobleman, anyone at all, who could prevent the empire from splintering. Foreign spies entered the palace in disguise, monks with forged orders, confessors without dioceses. One was caught hiding a vial of poison in the lining of a hymnal. Another was arrested after being found mapping the corridors of the royal apartments. All of them wanted one thing, the king's final breath. Because it was that breath, not law, not lineage, that would determine who held Spain. And then, it came. Witnesses say the room filled with the scent of sulfur. Others claim the air grew unnaturally still. The fire in the hearth hissed. The dogs in the courtyard howled. Charles's body convulsed. His eyes rolled back. His lips moved in frantic Latin, though the words were incoherent, scraps of prayers, fragments of dreams. His hands clawed at the sheets. Then at nothing. Then stillness. A priest leaned in close, whispered the final rites. There was no response. The man who had been king for 35 years, a king who never ruled, never commanded, never fathered, lay in twisted repose. In death, he resembled what he had always been in life, a relic. A ruin. A prophecy fulfilled. Mariana stood at the foot of his bed. She did not cry. In her final letter, written the morning after, she recorded only one sentence: the throne is empty, and I am no longer afraid. Charles's death ended an empire. If you've made it this far and haven't subscribed, why not? Drop your reason in the comments. The Past Whisper community wants to hear it. The bells rang. All across Spain, the great bronze mouths of cathedrals announced the death of a king. But there was no mourning. Not truly. There was only calculation. In Paris, Vienna, and London, the silence lasted minutes before pens scratched paper, messengers were summoned, treaties reopened. The body had barely cooled when the vultures began circling. France claimed the throne. The boy King Philip of Anjou, grandson of Louis XIV, was declared Charles's successor. A Bourbon, not a Habsburg. The bloodline was broken. The dynasty ended. Austria, outraged, declared the will invalid. Britain, seeing its trade interests threatened, declared the move destabilizing. And the war began. The War of the Spanish Succession lasted more than a decade. It bled Europe dry. Armies marched through Flanders, through Italy, through the Spanish countryside. Tens of thousands died. Entire cities were razed. Villages that had once received royal decrees were reduced to ash. Spain itself was carved like meat. The Netherlands were handed to Austria. Naples and Milan lost. The empire that had once spanned oceans now fractured into isolated islands of influence. The colonies felt the fracture. In the Americas, governors found themselves abandoned, their orders delayed or contradicted. Ships arrived with new flags and contradictory demands. Some territories defected. Others drifted. A few began dreaming of independence. And in Madrid, treasures disappeared. Tapestries from Burgos. Manuscripts from Toledo. Paintings by El Greco, Velázquez, Titian, gone. Some sold, some stolen, some quietly gifted to foreign ambassadors in exchange for mercy. The court was hollowed out. Marble halls stood silent. And the Inquisition, once the iron hand of the monarchy, faded. No announcement was made. No grand gesture of closure. It simply stopped. With the monarchy's authority shattered, the power to police thought, heresy, and rebellion lost its spine. Files were left incomplete. Trials delayed indefinitely. Torches in the dungeons extinguished one by one. The empire that once baptized continents in blood and gold ended not in flames, but in dust. And in the stillness that followed, only the paintings remained. Portraits of a boy with a broken jaw. Of a man who never spoke. Of a king who ruled over nothing but silence. If you're still here, it means you understand what most never will. That history isn't just about dates or treaties, it's about silence. And who breaks it? Subscribe to Past Whisper History. Because the past isn't gone. It's just been buried. And we're here to dig. Charles II died without an heir. Without a legacy. Without even a signature that was truly his own. And yet, what he left behind reshaped the world in ways no conqueror ever could. He changed blood. His death became the closing chapter in one of the most catastrophic genetic experiments in recorded history. Historians would later call it dynastic inbreeding. Biologists would call it an unbroken cycle of homozygosity. Alleles reinforcing each other across generations until the body collapses beneath the weight of its own lineage. Charles became the cautionary tale in genetic textbooks. His coefficient of inbreeding, over 25%, was higher than that found in laboratory mice specifically bred for homogeneity. A living human with the internal damage of a test subject, molded not by nature, but by power. His bones were misshapen, his nervous system compromised, his reproductive system non-viable. But this wasn't only science. It was politics. He became the final proof that bloodlines could not sustain kingdoms. That the illusion of divine right, propped up by marriages between cousins and nieces, would not preserve legacy, but poison it. After Charles, the language of monarchy began to change. Subtle at first. Quiet. But real. In the courts of Europe, royal matches were no longer only about consolidation, they became about diversity, about vitality, about appearance. The Habsburgs had revealed what happens when a royal face no longer looked human. So future dynasties selected spouses who were photogenic, healthy, modern. Royalty became performance. Not just divine, but digestible. The politics of appearance had begun. And that legacy did not stop at palaces. Centuries later, Charles's story would find its way into darker corners of modern science. In early 20th century Europe, geneticists studying inherited disorders cited the Habsburgs in their arguments. Eugenics movements across the West invoked Charles's name, not with empathy, but with calculation. This, they said, is what happens when we allow impurity, or too much purity. He was no longer a child. No longer a king. He was data. Today, the palace where he was born, the Royal Alcazar of Madrid, is gone. Burned in 1734, reduced to rubble and ash. A new palace stands in its place, glittering with chandeliers and ceremonial dignity. But the foundations are still the same. Beneath those stones, he was born. Beneath those walls, a nation prayed for a child to save its bloodline, and received a mirror instead. And though the crown moved on, and the world forgot, his story remained. Not in power. Not in monuments. But in warnings. If you've followed his life this far, you already know he was never a monster. He was the result. The echo. The end. Subscribe to Past Whisper History, because no one else will tell you the truth like this. And if you still don't believe this story matters, then say so. In the comments. We're listening. And so is history. For over 300 years, this story was wrapped in silence. Not by accident. By design. Religion demanded reverence. A king could not be born broken without challenging the sanctity of divine rule. Ego demanded denial. Monarchs could not admit failure without inviting collapse. Nationalism demanded pride. Spain could not face the shame of a dynasty that destroyed itself. And fear, the oldest tool of all, sealed the doors, burned the letters, buried the bones. The result was erasure. Official portraits painted lies. Histories glossed over deformities. Foreign accounts were dismissed as propaganda. The people were told what to remember. And what to forget. But history has a sound. It doesn't shout. It doesn't rage. It whispers. Through broken letters. Through sketches smuggled in prayer books. Through the silence of servants who could not speak but could not forget. It whispered through the torn pages of Mariana's diary. Through the false crown reshaped to fit a soft skull. Through the crooked hallway where Charles was wheeled, trembling, past windows he never opened. It whispered until someone listened. And now you have. Look at the Habsburg family tree. Look closely. It starts wide, proud, branching. But then it folds inward. The names repeat. The blood circles. The faces blur. And at the very end, a single name. No air beneath it. No line extending beyond it. Just a single, silent branch. Charles. This wasn't just the story of a failed king. It was the story of ambition without restraint. Of silence weaponized. Of power so absolute it could ignore the body's cry for help. If you've been with us through this journey, you already know, this is what history looks like when no one dares speak it. Subscribe to Past Whisper History. Not for Charles. For every truth like his, waiting in the dark. Because silence is what let this happen. And silence is what ends, with you.